Hey Chris, it's Shaun. I'm gonna start building that Bad Larry desk we talked about. Just give me a call back whenever you have a chance.
I'll try to get a hold of him later, I guess. So if you know Chris Salamone, and I assume you do if you're watching this video, you probably know his credenza design that he calls the Bad Larry. It's a great looking piece with plenty of really nice angles, and if I had to choose one piece to really describe Chris's design aesthetic, it would be this one. Now, cut to a few months ago, and Chris and I made an updated version of the Bad Larry with a few design tweaks and a totally redesigned base. Then maybe a month after that, I had someone contact me and ask if I could make them a desk inspired by that piece. I had gone through a few design iterations with the client, and we settled on a fairly simple and clean version that still had an obvious nod to the original Bad Larry. So with that, I got started, and the first thing I built was the desktop, which I made from solid walnut. At this point, I would usually skip over a lot of the milling process, but this time I used a technique to joint boards that are wider than my jointer, and I feel like that is something worth highlighting. I actually have an entire video explaining this process in detail over on my channel, so I'll put a link to that in the description. But the condensed version is basically to start by jointing as much of one side of a board as possible, then use a piece of plywood or MDF to reference that flattened portion on your planer bed to then flatten the opposite side of the board. Finally, I'll flip the board over one last time to plane off the portion that was missed during the original jointing process. So with both faces flat and parallel on each board, I could then finish the milling process as usual by jointing one edge, then ripping the opposite edge on the table saw before getting ready to glue up the entire panel. At this point, with the top in the clamps, it was time to get started on the cabinets, so I figured I would get Chris on the line to see if he could give me any insight into his Bad Larry design. Yo!
What's up, man?
Hey, so just really quick, I don't have much time, so just give me your thoughts on building this Bad Larry desk.
Yeah, I looked at the drawing, it looks cool. But I would say that the things that I get asked about the most for that one, trouble finding those spots where, like, Big Mac. I haven't had a Big Mac in like 5 years, but those things were my favorite. I remember when I was a little kid, and I will say they seem smaller. Like, I remember, Big Mac obviously it should be big, right? But they don't seem that big anymore. I remember when I was a little kid, it was so big to me that I used to have to eat it too. I would take it apart and I would eat the top bun and then everything in between all the way down to the middle bun. So that was like a regular burger. I would eat that, and then I had myself a little tostada left over. So it was kind of like almost 2 burgers, but
as you can see, I started by breaking down a couple sheets of walnut plywood. I wanted the 2 cabinets to have the grain wrap around them, so I started by cutting each panel to just over its finished dimension. Then moved on to cutting the miters, and I started with all of the 45-degree bevel cuts. With the 45-degree cuts done, I then moved on to the non-90-degree corners of the cabinets. The cabinet side is angled at 10 degrees from 90. In order to make these bevel cuts, I set my saw blade to 50 degrees, which gives me 50 degrees from horizontal and 40 degrees from vertical. Now, to actually make these cuts, I'll start with my 40-degree bevels, which required the workpiece to be run through the saw vertically. I'll then cut the last of the miters by cutting the 50-degree bevels, since these are much easier to sneak up on a perfect fit than the vertical cuts, because I can use my table saw fence to dial them in. So with all of the bevels cut, I can now get ready for the glue up by cutting in some dominoes. One thing here is that because I have that acute angle at the top of the cabinet, I have to cut in shorter domino mortises and trim down some dominoes to make sure they fit into that joint. So now that the cabinets were glued up, I could cut and attach some 1/16 of an inch thick edge banding. And this was easy enough. It was just a matter of matching the miter angles at each corner. And you know what edge banding with blue tape means. So with the cabinets pretty much done, I could then focus on getting the drawers built and fitted. Because of the angled cabinet side, I had to cut some angled spacers so that the drawer slides had a 90-degree surface to be attached to. I could calculate my drawer box dimensions and start making those. And one of the main things here is how to deal with all of the little scraps. I know we're always talking about scrap wood trick shots, but you know what? Just forget all that and have your table saw throw your scraps away for you. Work smarter, not harder, right? Had my cabinets built and my drawers taken care of, and I could then cut a rabbet around the back of each cabinet to accept a back panel. And I did this with my router and a rabbeting bit, then squared up the corners with a chisel. To make the back panel, I directly referenced the cabinet and cut the panel to proper height, then cut the angle with my track saw. The last thing to fabricate for the cabinets were the bases, and these were just simple mitered rectangles that essentially made a toe kick under each cabinet. Now that the cabinets were just about done, I could go back to working on the desktop as well as the riser blocks to lift the desktop off of the cabinets. These risers were a fairly insignificant part of the piece and will mostly be hidden, but I still wanted to make them interesting, so I cut some angles and bevels onto each one just to give them a little bit of visual interest. With those ready, I could finally get back to working on the desktop, which needed a little bit of smoothing. And I don't often bust out the hand planes for something like this, but every once in a while when I'm feeling a little bit brave, I will get after it without electricity. And while I go low tech smoothing out this desktop, let me tell you about something that is high tech, and that is building a website with Squarespace. The best part about Squarespace is that it can make low-tech people like me and my hand plane seem high-tech. The idea of setting up a website can be daunting, especially when incorporating things like online stores, inventory management, and secure payment systems. But Squarespace makes all of that simple without needing to be a coder or a great web designer, and that's because they have a ton of award-winning templates, each of which is optimized to work on desktop or mobile browsers, where essentially all you have to do is plug in your information and images, and you'll end up with a great looking result that will work anywhere. As you can see here, I'm able to create new product pages on my website with just a few clicks of my mouse. So I'm always able to keep my online store updated with whatever furniture pieces I have available. It's all pretty simple and straightforward, but if you ever were in need of help, they have 24/7 email support to help answer any questions you might have. So if you're thinking about starting a website, or even if you already have one, go check out Squarespace to see if it might be a better option for you. Head over to squarespace.com/4eyes for a free trial. Then when you're ready to launch, use the offer code 4eyes to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. All right, thanks Squarespace. Let's get back to the build. So with the analog work out of the way, I could then plug back into the grid and trim the desktop to final dimension. I also added a 10-degree bevel around the entire thing to match the angle on the side of the cabinets.
People knock McDonald's, but I love it. It's good. I'm loving it. Right there, it says it in the name.
So now with the cabinets and the desktop done, the last thing that I needed to fabricate were the drawer fronts. In a situation like this, I like to glue up a panel that fits the entire cabinet opening and cut it to a perfect fit in the same way that I made the back panels. I can then cut the whole panel into the individual drawer fronts using my table saw blade width to give me perfectly sized reveals between each drawer. Because my saw blade is 1/8 of an inch thick, that will give me a 1/16 between each drawer front. I could then install all of the drawer slides and drawer boxes to make sure everything fit properly. Finally, I could make some poles for each drawer. For these, I just drew a profile on the end of a walnut block, then used a combination of my table saw and router table to get pretty close to what I drew. From there, I could cut them into individual drawer pulls, then cut recesses into each of the drawer fronts so that the pull could be attached. At this point, I was finally ready to add some finish, and we opted to go with a polyurethane for this one. Being that it's a desk and it would be getting a lot of use, the client and I agreed that the extra protection would be worth it. right, so there you go, a Bad Larry inspired desk. This was fun to kind of start with a specific design scheme already in place, then carry it to a different piece of furniture. So thank you as always for watching. I really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed this one. And of course, until next time, if you ever get Chris on a Google Hangout, just be prepared and have a planned escape route.
Right? Get those forearms going. Also, you use your grip strength all the time, especially in the shop or something. Like,
cool, dude.
hands, man,
Yeah,
hey man,
thank you. I gotta go.
Extra
Thank you,
set,
dude.
right?
I really
Never
appreciate
have too
it.
many clamps,
All right, man.
never
Talk
have
to you
too many
later.
hands.
Nice shirt, by the way. All right, talk to you later.
Every
Bye.
day, man,